Right.
I would say I was having this conversation with one of my directs. We were in a one-on-one the other day, and I think for me it starts with transparency. Right? We always talk about how we arm people and empower people, but do people understand the lens through which their actions, decisions, or whatever it might be, will be evaluated and or judged? Right? To your point, like there's a career ladder. Like here's how you get to the next level. Here's level expectations, and again leaning into it and being transparent and conquering those things head on. Like here's how I make decisions. Here's how I handle mistakes or incidents, right? And here's kind of the way that I am being very transparent about that, right? One of the topics I was talking about a couple of weeks ago was, I tend to catch up on work late at night. A lot of meetings during the day, it's nature of the beast, and I'll follow up with stuff that people need from me or things that they're concerned about. And generally speaking, that goes well into the night and early morning. And one of the things that I am very, very explicit about is if I ask you a question, or if ultimately it is a question. If I ask you a question at midnight in Slack, number one, I'm not calling you, I'm not texting you. I do not expect an answer at all until whenever the next business day is. And that's something that I hold dear. I know, that's something that I probably should, be better about, like that. I think that there's the semi-later function. Most of the time I forget about it, and that's on me, so that they're not trying to waking up at 3:00 in the morning, seeing a text from me and feeling this need or pressure to answer. But kind of getting back to it, I think a lot of it comes down to how transparent are you about what it is you're doing, what the team's doing, what your perspective is, both the good and the bad, and how your team or teams fit into that decision-making criteria. But also, transparency on its own isn't enough. And I think the second part of that is, being very consistent in those things, right? So here's how I make decisions. If I change how I make decisions, that's definitely inconsistent. And that starts to give rise to, is he gonna like this or is he not, right? And being consistent about how we handle mistakes. Mistakes happen. I always say, at some point in your career, you're gonna cause a Sub 1 or Sub 2. It's gonna happen. There's very little that you can do to stop it, right? But here's how I handle these things. Like, yes, they're mistakes. I don't need to remind you about it, because chances are, we all have a sense of pride in our work. And, if something that you check in or deploy ends up causing an incident, you're naturally going to feel bad about that. I don't even need to remind you, right? And we're going to have we'll diagnose the incident and all this other fun stuff, and you will naturally learn, right? And all of these words need to be backed up by actions, right? You have to, when we go through incidents, I'm expecting people to look at me and see how I react to those things, right? Again, it's all learning. And when those words are backed up by action, or at least I am consistent in the things I do and reasonably transparent about the things that I can absolutely be transparent about. That all kind of leads towards a culture where we all tend to know exactly what we're doing. We know why we're doing it. I think, the why always matters. And the way that I do things is very consistent and doesn't change, not in the sense of it's inflexible, but you always know what to expect and aren't scared to share bad news, right? You're not scared to say, oh, we had an incident. Oh, you're not scared to make a mistake because it's going to be a learn. Like, you're not scared to make a decision because you know how I would evaluate it. And so, that feeling of, and I guess we would call it psychological safety. Like, I want people to feel safe, and I'm not going to go bite their heads off on the decision. I might not be happy about it, right? And that's okay, but that doesn't make them a horrible dev or less of a person, or feel that like they should be scared to come to work the next day, right? We all make mistakes. To your point about perfection earlier, nobody's perfect. I certainly am not perfect. I have created all kinds of incidents in my career, and I have learned from every single one of them, and that has shaped, how I have developed in my own growth journey. I'm no different than anybody else. I just might be older. That's about it.
It sounds like transparency and consistency are
two tools you use to build cultures where your people feel safe and empowered to bring their unique talents to everything that they do. What else is in your toolbox that helps you build those cultures?
I would say probably the next most important one is it's time. I have one-on-ones with everybody that reports through me. Perhaps not as often as I'd like, but again, when we think about you can be transparent, you can be consistent from a distance, right? And probably the next biggest tool in that toolbox is minimizing that distance. And I don't want people to feel like that I'm not approachable. Like I'm sitting in some ivory tower throwing decisions out, for them to go pick up, right? It's by minimizing the distance between myself and certainly my directs or my skips or so on and so forth. That oftentimes gives me a lot more perspective in what they're going through based upon some of the decisions that I've made, right? So when we talk about not being perfect, I'm certainly not the most perfect leader on the planet by any margin, but without that feedback loop, right, you're not building a culture of being able to speak up or manage up or deliver bad news, whether it's to their direct line manager, their skip, or et cetera, et cetera. And the more often that I talk with folks, and oftentimes it's sometimes it's about very personal things, sometimes it's just kind of shooting the breeze. The other times it's like, hey, I've seen this, and observations, and kind of digging into it, kind of having that perspective that my first manager certainly did not, in that inquisitive nature. But being able to kind of tie in all of the things that we've just talked about, but also hearing it from me directly, and not just by observing me in our Q1 status or or all hands or things like that. It's getting to know these people on an individual basis and understanding more about them, because again, as I'm sure you've noted and talked to other folks as well, you can't manage everybody exactly the same. And if you're trying to build that culture and you're trying to get the most that you can out of them, you naturally have to take everything that they are and figure out ways to blend it in. And if you don't know what their strengths, their weaknesses, the the things that make them unique, that they can bring to the table, you're going to be missing out on a whole lot of interesting opportunities that might not otherwise present themselves. Whether it's a specific, hey, I've used this tool before, here's how we can integrate it, great. Here's how we've handled incidents at, Google or Meta or any of the other places folks have come from. By just sitting there and listening and taking action, right? Like you can tell me all these things, but if I don't really internalize it and put it to use, kind of what's the point? It becomes more of a checkbox. And so, those skip level one-on-ones and hearing their stories, figuring out what makes them tick, and how do I best position them, their team, for opportunities that leverage those skill sets, and how does that make them feel like they can bring all of this to the table, even though that might not be something they have traditionally been responsible for. So there's a lot of different things in there, but certainly the transparency, consistency, and you got to know the people, right? If you're not having one-on-ones with them, start. It takes a lot of time, but it's time very well spent.